Running a Crusade campaign has got to be the most rewarding experience playing Warhammer 40k. I've spent 4 years running at least 9 narrative campaigns since Crusade was first launched in 2020. And in this video, I'm compiling everything I've learned over the years to help you become a better campaign master for Crusade. This video is an advanced guide for people who've played Crusade before and want to run a narrative campaign of their own. If you're a newer player, I recommend you watch my beginner's guide to help you get started in the wide world of Warhammer 40k Crusade. Now without further ado, here are the 5 things you need to know in order to run an epic Crusade campaign. Number 1. Know your players. The first thing you do when planning a campaign is to think about who you want to participate in it in the first place. The ultimate goal of any campaign is to make sure players have fun. But you need to know who those players are first. Are they your friends just looking for fun on the weekends? Or are they people in your local store that are heavily invested in deep narratives? What do their time commitments look like? All these are important questions to ask before you even start planning a campaign. Warhammer is an extensive hobby and people enjoy different aspects of it. The last thing you want to do is write 10,000 paragraphs of deep history, lore, and character biographies, and nobody shows up to play. You want to cater campaigns to your players. Start by asking your friends or the people at your local gaming store and get to know what they enjoy. It's actually really easy to find out what people like. Just listen to what they talk about the most. Do they rave about datasheets? Chances are they enjoy playing the game. Do they introduce their characters by name? Then they probably enjoy the narrative. But if they enter the store like this, they probably just enjoy the company. If you want to go really advanced, a handy tool to use is a psychographic. It's something used in advertising to create a profile for your target audience. It captures lifestyle choices like work routines, time spent on hobbies, interests, and more. A psychographic categorizes them into broad generalizations so you can effectively target a group. How does this help Crusade, you may ask? Well, at a glance, you will be able to see what kind of things players will enjoy. I recommend you do more research about how to use this tool properly if you really want to dig deeper. As an example, myself and a few other admins run seasonal Crusade campaigns in Singapore. If you don't know where that is, it's here. Like here. All the way down there. We're an island city made up of lots of urban areas. Most Singaporean adults work a 9-to-5 job, which often includes overtime. We also have numerous family commitments. People have kids to attend to, or elderly parents to take care of. Thus, we may only be able to play 40k once every few weeks. We also realized that most players just enjoy hanging out and playing games. 40k serves as a nice break from all the hectic things in life. But there were also a handful of people that enjoyed the deep narrative aspect. Thus, our campaign had to be designed to encourage playing games while also having a narrative for players to be invested in. So we decided to adopt a galactic war format, similar to what Helldivers is doing right now. We came up with a broad overarching narrative, several planets for players to fight over, and a campaign score to track each faction's progress in the war. Even if a player could only play 3 games, they could still contribute to their overarching faction story, and it was up to them how much they wanted to participate in the narrative. This is called establishing a format, which is what we will talk about next. A format is basically the framework which provides tangible goals for your players. Every war ever waged has an objective or objectives to achieve. Armies don't fight for no reason. There's always something one side wants, which the other is not willing to give up. And as the campaign master, your job is to create that conflict. After you've understood what your players enjoy, you will have to craft a scoring system of some kind around it. Your narrative plays a supporting role in setting the stage for this, and we will look at that in the next section. A good story is important, but not as important as your format. You will need to make tangible objectives that are clearly defined and the means by which your players will achieve them. These are the 3 questions to keep in mind. How do I win? How am I going to do that? And how long do I have? Returning to my example earlier, in order to win the campaign season, an alliance must have the highest strategic points after 12 weeks. Strategic points represent the many goals each faction has in the narrative, whether that be achieving military victories, political goals, or recovering ancient artifacts. In order for alliances to win strategic points, an alliance must have the highest campaign points by the end of 3 weeks, making one campaign phase. Each player must contribute to this pool by winning battles, holding territory, and completing occasional faction agendas. Now that's a lot to say in one go, but basically this system rewards players who play as frequently as possible and encourages alliances to work together to secure enough points within a given phase. So you can see that our players are encouraged to play games against different people as many times as possible. This is how your format scoring system should support your players' idea of fun. You don't have to adopt such a complex scoring system as ours though. It was created specifically to cater to a large quantity of players that participated in our campaign. The various ways to gain campaign points was added specifically to address balance, which is another factor we will talk about later in the video. Try to keep your scoring method as simple as possible. It could be as simple as winning X number of games over a period of time, or you could adopt a mission tree, or it could even be to complete secret objectives throughout the course of each battle. As long as your players are aware of how they're going to win the campaign, how they're going to do it, and by when, your format has done its job. Once you've done that, make sure your players are able to easily access the score sheet at any time. They must be able to clearly see the goal which they are working towards. Psychologically, this gives them something to think about in between games and drives their desire to either catch up or stay in the lead, which drives participation. But in order to get your players invested in your format, you're going to need a compelling narrative. So now, crafting a narrative. Writing a quality Warhammer 40k story is very difficult. I come from a filmmaking background, and story structure has been drilled into me till it's become second nature. It's a huge topic for a whole other video. But for this one, we will look specifically at how to get your players invested in the here and now. What's at stake for each of the factions in this campaign? Which brings us to our first point, stakes. Each faction has something tangible to lose if they do not participate in the campaign. The Imperium could lose a world, Chaos could lose the favor of the Dark Gods, the Eldar could lose a large number of Spirit Stones, and so on. Decide on one common objective for each faction or alliance, and have the others fight for control over it. Make sure these things are tangible, so that everyone has a clear picture of what it is they're fighting for, and when they achieve it. These must be mutually exclusive. If one side gets it, the other cannot. This creates tension, and it's what gets people invested. You will also have to establish why this thing is so important to each faction. The key to getting your players invested in a story is not the grand set-piece battles, mass destruction, or some complex prophecy that's common to 40k stories. It is the human experience, and your tangible objective is the outward expression of that. Now you don't have to go too deep, and in fact I'd recommend you don't do it at all, as most players hate being preached to during game time. It's better to evoke just a semblance of emotion, enough that people can relate to, but not too much till it feels like therapy. My script writing teacher used this analogy. Imagine your story is a bottle of medicine. Your core themes are the icky, bitter bits that will cure the patient, aka the players. It's good for them, but people will hate to swallow that kind of stuff. So some pharmacists add sweet syrup, which is like all the cool things, Space Marines, Necrons, bolters, explosions, chainswords, and the like, to make it more palatable. This is the same for story writing, except in the case of Crusade stories, you will be adding lots and lots and lots of syrup. Again, adjust the taste, because some of your players may want that deep experience. This is why knowing your players is so important. So how do you go about writing a compelling narrative? Start by identifying a core theme you want to explore. The Bad Up War was about the failure of a system and how it forces good citizens to become rebels. The War in Heaven was about the desperation to achieve dreams and becoming bitter when everything goes wrong. And my favorite, The Horus Heresy, was about an absent father and the damage it has on kids. Once you've done that, factor in the factions you know your players will be bringing. How will those factions express themselves in response to this core theme? Write your stakes based on that. For example, 10th edition started with the 4th Tyrannic War. My campaign, called the Rostova Crusade, was about hopelessness in the face of overwhelming odds, but picking yourself up and to keep going. This morphed into the story of the fortress world of Rostova. The Tyranids swept unopposed across Segmentum Pacificus for a long time as the Imperium struggled to mobilize an effective response to them. The fortress world of Rostova was chosen as a key bastion to finally halt the Xenos invasion. Forces from all over the Imperium were mustered there to receive the Tyranids. But the armies of Chaos, eager to exploit the Imperium's weakness, invaded the planet as well. If Rostova fell, the Imperium's western flank could be in turmoil, allowing Chaos offensives to happen in other parts of the galaxy. And with that context, I asked my players to decide the fate of Rostova on the tabletop. For 12 weeks, the Imperium fought against the Tyranids and Chaos, with a smattering of other Xenos forces. Although they put up a valiant defense, Rostova fell to the Tyranids and opened a gaping hole in Segmentum Pacificus. Now imagine you were a player in this setting. Wouldn't you feel invested as well? So before you begin hammering away on Google Docs, remember, stakes and reasons. But all that is useless if you cannot sustain interest. So let's talk about that. Don't you hate it when you set out to do something, but after 2 weeks, your interest fades away and you stop doing it completely? That's actually quite common and happens in a lot of things. Just like the watch time on my videos, so like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications to help the algorithm. Anyway, sustaining interest. You've got an accurate understanding of your players, you've got a robust format, and a gripping narrative. How do you keep people playing? I'll start by saying that a drop-off is guaranteed. Life happens, and sometimes people can't commit to a long campaign. You'll just have to accept that. So you should focus on retaining the players who are interested in sticking with the campaign for a long time. You will generally see this happen on week 3 of your campaign. So to sustain interest, we need to focus on these two things: investment and balance. Investment is how invested your players are over the course of your campaign. Depending on the length of your crusade, people can get tired of playing. They will need some motivation to continue, and you can provide these by reinforcing the narrative and the format. Provide weekly score updates to celebrate achievements and encourage runner-ups to push even harder. Then use that to create a narrative summary of how the world was affected since the player's involvement. Make them feel as if their actions had impacted the universe in some way. The key here is to celebrate how much players have shaped the outcome. Humans love positive reinforcement, especially if it's in regards to being part of a larger cause. This is why I focus so much on making tangible objectives and reasons to care. Players will always be able to see their progress in achieving it, and you can leverage on these emotions to drive them to work even harder. Make sure you celebrate milestones during your crusade. That could be every few weeks or after several games, depending on your format. These are like checkpoints and should be used at moments that you predict your players' interest starts to wane. These are the times they will need that positive reinforcement. Make it a big thing. Write a major narrative moment and highlight players who have stood out during the phase. Maybe the Tyranids have successfully made landfall and as a result were able to overrun a hive city. But in its glorious defense, the Imperial player, let's call him Bob. Bob fought 15 battles over the past 2 weeks, bravely holding back the horde long enough to evacuate the civilians. Maybe an NPC cardinal was able to evacuate, and now Bob has a good standing with the ecclesiarchy. Something like that. Recognize those who have participated frequently, and make your world respond to them. Now let's talk about a very difficult topic: balance. I'm sure we all have issues with Warhammer balance thus far. There will always be strong armies and those that have fallen behind. That's a problem because if the army is not doing too well, players might not want to play them in Crusade games. It drastically affects the narrative scores as well. When Leviathan was first released, Tyranids were doing pretty well, but we noticed a drop-off in Tyranid players once people realized their shortcomings. By the time Pariah Nexus was released, we noticed almost nobody was playing Tyranids, even though they were a key part of the story. We even had to adjust the story midway through to introduce a new big bad faction, because we initially wrote Tyranids as the main antagonists of the story. Unfortunately, I think we shouldn't attempt to balance factions with house rules. It'll just create an uneven baseline and will easily confuse players about the faction's capabilities overall. But what we can do is to balance campaign mechanics to account for this difference. What we're concerned about here are representation and power differences. When I talk about representation, I'm referring to how many players decide to play each faction. In my example about Pariah Nexus, we saw at most one Tyranid player, but tons of people on the Necron side due to the strength of the army. So we have Tyranids underrepresented and Necrons overrepresented. Since my format rewards players who play frequently, the Necrons faction will get a ton of points while Tyranids get almost nothing. So how do we balance this? Well, we did it with alliances. Similar to Age of Sigmar, we grouped factions with similar narrative goals together. But more importantly, we made sure to add mid-tier factions to shore up the underrepresented ones. In my campaign, the Tyranids were invading the Pariah Nexus, but so was Chaos. So they were grouped into the Invaders Alliance. The Necrons were defending, but since we only had a single Votann player, we wrote in a Lost Ancestor core somewhere in the sector. So the Votann had motivation to be placed in the Protectors Alliance together with the Necrons. Meanwhile, we knew there were a lot of Imperium players. So now we end up with 3 different alliances, each containing strong armies and struggling ones. Now the campaign points look more even and no alliance gets curb stomped because of faction power level. This is how we balance factions in a points-based campaign. Aside from faction power level, we also had to balance player skill. Singapore's 40k scene is quite fortunate to have a number of newer players joining every few months, but we also have veterans who know how to play the game at a very high level. When these two players meet, it could potentially become a seal clubbing game. Thankfully, a lot of the veteran players are quite aware this may happen, so they usually give pointers during the game or run less optimized lists for Crusade. In fact, we haven't seen any Ironstorm lists, and Necron Hypercrypt players bring at most 2 Catan, so that helps a little bit. But tactics and list building play a huge part in individual games. While it's a great chance to help newer players learn advanced strategies and play the game better, we don't want those players to feel like they're being a burden to their faction. Every player should feel like they were contributing something. To remedy this, we introduced campaign points into our format. Instead of it being based purely on battles won, we based it on battles played, in addition to extra objectives. We awarded campaign points for the pointage of the game, so incursion size was 1 point, strike force 2 points, onslaught 3. We even encouraged team games, so newer players could team up with 1000 points each to play against a more experienced player at 2000 points. That would award each of the newer players 2 campaign points for playing a larger game. We also introduced weekly missions, which was basically supposed to represent the state of the war thus far. Those gave players who played them additional campaign points. We borrowed this idea from gacha games, so those of you who play Genshin Impact or Art Knights would know very well what I'm talking about. It basically incentivizes players to play these missions in order to gain campaign points for their faction, thereby increasing their involvement in Crusade as a whole. But factions also need something extra, so we introduced Secret Orders, which was a term used for a similar balancing mechanic in 9th edition Crusade. Each faction will need to complete certain requirements, like destroy 50 enemy units or complete 50 agendas. And because each faction can do it, alliances with multiple factions are each eligible to complete them. This gives a boost to overall campaign points. So for example, the Tyranids could focus on completing agendas, which are pretty easy by the way. Check out my review on Tyranids Crusade rules to find out more. While Chaos can focus on destroying enemy units. Each faction feels like they're working towards a larger goal because of this. And in turn, each player feels like they're empowered to excel at their strengths and have others shore up their weaknesses. So that was a handful of information. Let's summarize it quickly for you. The heart of sustaining interest is making players feel important. To do that, you need to do 2 things: get them invested and balance the game. To get them invested, let the narrative respond to their actions so every player feels like they have agency in this world. To balance the game, find ways to let struggling armies and newer players contribute more to the campaign scores. Do this via your format. If you've done all these right, your campaign should be an exciting experience over the 12 weeks or however long you're running it. But all things must come to an end, so it's time to tabulate the scores and declare a winner. Ending something is always harder than it sounds. As a filmmaker, I struggle a lot with this. Your players have been on a grueling journey and you've played some kind of grand finale. How do you end the campaign while making those who didn't win feel like they've been through an epic battle? We'll do it the same way as sustaining interest, but ramp it up to 11. We're going to show them how their participation has changed the world you created forever. To do this, we will pull out the handy dandy epilogue. There are several ingredients you'll need to include for this narrative ending: stakes claimed, lives changed, and further consequences. Stakes claimed. Remember in the narrative section we talked about stakes? Now is the time for the winner to claim it and fulfill their objective, while those who lost will have to deal with the consequences. Oh, and don't cheapen the stakes by writing, "and suddenly reinforcements arrived, everything's okay." That cheapens the experience and will make players feel like they were cheated of their victory. For the winning side, write about how the battle was hard fought, the sacrifices made, but how it was absolutely worth it in the end. Show the players that every battle they fought mattered, and how it contributed to achieve this outcome. For those who lost, write about how they fought valiantly, even though the scores may not reflect it. It's important to do this because you want the losing side to feel as if their actions mattered. Even if the score gap is drastic, you want to encourage them to return to play in your next campaign, so make sure their efforts are recognized. Now, lives changed. What is this? We've got to wrap up that narrative section about reasons to care. Your armies are made up of individuals. You will need to show how this experience has affected their lives. War takes a huge toll on people, and the same should be for your characters. What did they lose? What did they learn? What are they gonna do going forward? Ask your players for permission to feature some of their characters, and have them interact with the wider 40k lore. For example, in the 4th Tyrannic War, an Astra Militarum colonel who lost the campaign could be racked with guilt for abandoning so many of his men to their fate, only to be summoned by Guilliman for commendation. The Necrons who won the Pariah Nexus campaign get lordship over more territory by the Silent King, making other dynasties jealous of them. Focus on the internal emotions of the characters based on your story's theme. They must never be the same again after this campaign. Something in their lives needs to change, whether it is something good or bad. And because this is 40k, we must end the narrative with, "This was only the beginning." You're probably tired of hearing this from movies and TV shows, but it is absolutely crucial for 40k campaigns. The reason you hate this in TV shows is because you see that narrative threads were purposefully left open to make way for a sequel. The story wasn't completed, and you got cheated of your whole experience. But the reason why this works for 40k is because of its grander narrative themes. 40k is called grimdark because things always gets worse. Everything that happens has far-reaching consequences for the entire galaxy. A failure in one area always opens the door to more destruction elsewhere. As a rule of thumb, there should never be any happy endings in 40k, only greater evils in the making. That is why you must always end your campaign by telling players that their actions have greater consequences. What they've done was so important that it'll affect many lives moving forward. It strangely has the opposite effect from traditional stories, because we're doubling down on player investment. All that build-up during the campaign finally results in something. In some sense, yes, there's a sequel. Your player characters will now form grudges or friendships with other characters just by playing throughout the campaign. They've grown alongside each other, or been deeply scarred, and you want to make those characters meet again, and show how much they've grown. And looking at it from a player's perspective, they've now made a new friend. You want to encourage this friendship to deepen by playing more games. It's a win-win in real life and in narrative. That's why I really love playing narrative 40k. You get to share life together through your characters. I think that's a great place to end the video. So in summary, 5 steps to run an epic campaign. Know your players so you can tailor a fun experience to their tastes. Establish a format so players have a goal to work towards. Craft a narrative to give them reasons to achieve that goal. Sustain interest by making sure every player knows they've affected the world in some way. And end it well by giving closure to the format and narrative so that players will be eager to return for your next campaign. Now you're ready to run an epic crusade. That sounds great and all, but what happens if you don't have anyone to play with? Some of you brought this problem up in my comments, and I'm looking into it to see if there's a way we could do Crusade on Tabletop Simulator. But if you don't want to wait, or you just want to have a chill afternoon session, I have a solution for you. In my next video, I will be looking at how to play a single-player Crusade using an expansion by Goonhammer called Fury of the Swarm. So subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon for notifications on when that video goes live. Until then, I will see you on the battlefield.